From the fall of 1996 till spring of 2000, I did my studies for the priesthood at Pope John XXIII National Seminary, a graduate school located just outside of Boston in the town of Weston, Massachusetts. While at Pope John's, I often listened to the public radio station affiliated with Boston University, WBUR. For many years, the station had a locally produced mid-morning broadcast called The Connection. The show was hosted by Christopher Lydon, a Boston-born, Yale-educated journalist, author, and broadcast personality. Sometime between the spring of 1999 and the spring of 2000, WBUR was heavily promoting an upcoming episode of The Connection featuring Christopher Lydon interviewing Harvard professor, paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of science, Stephen Jay Gould. Now, ordinarily, I would have looked forward to hearing Professor Gould speak. As an astronomy undergrad and graduate student, I had enjoyed reading books of collected essays he wrote for a monthly column that appeared in Natural History magazine called This View of Life. I was also familiar with Professor Gould's advocacy for the teaching of evolution in the public schools, which had made him a national public figure. You know you're an American pop culture icon when you're invited to voice yourself as a guest character on The Simpsons, which he did in the 1997 episode, Lisa the Skeptic. As I said, ordinarily I would have been sure to listen to the interview. However, each time the advertisement for the upcoming show aired, I remember thinking to myself, well, that's one I'll skip. My reason was Professor Gould would be talking up his latest book, Rocks of Ages, Science and Religion in the Fullness of Life. I assumed that both he and Lydon bought into the whole science versus religion conflict myth, and so I anticipated a discussion dismissive, if not outright hostile, towards religion. As a rule, I enjoy listening to thoughtful people of goodwill whose opinions I disagree with. However, I was at the time finishing my Master's of Divinity coursework while simultaneously preparing for my ordination to the priesthood. I had little or no intellectual bandwidth to spare, and so I thought I'd just give this interview a good leaving alone. The morning of the broadcast was a busy one for me. I was in the habit of turning my radio on each morning and leaving it on all day as quiet background noise. At some point, I left my dorm room. On my return, and after settling into whatever I was doing, I slowly became aware of a conversation taking place. As my attention turned to the conversation, I was shocked to hear Stephen Jay Gould say to Christopher Lydon something along the lines of, "Well, Christopher, this might upset some of our friends, but truth be told, the Catholic Church has been a good supporter of the sciences." Now, over the years, without success, I've tried to track down a transcript or recording of that radio show. I am aware of a December 15th, 2000 connection broadcast with Professor Gould, but it's not the one where his new book was being discussed. So you'll just have to take it on my word that Professor Gould did indeed make a statement with sentiments similar to what I have just described. I nearly fell out of my chair. I castigated myself for having once again assumed the worst and had come out the poorer. I listened to the rest of the interview and was so enthralled with what Professor Gould was saying that I went right out and bought a copy of his book. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that Gould's book has informed much of my thinking on the interplay between science and religion, and eventually led to my starting this very YouTube channel. Which reminds me to say, hi, I'm Father Doug McGonagle. I'm a Roman Catholic priest who also happens to be a radio astronomer. If you find my musings interesting or perhaps even thought-provoking, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. You might even want to click the notification bell too. I'm a full-time pastor who must squeeze the making of these little video indiscretions into my busy schedule, and so their posting will be catch as catch can. Thank you. So what did Professor Gould propose in his book that got me so excited? Well, let's backtrack a little to the widely held misconception that science and religion are in a permanent state of conflict, which I alluded to earlier. Since the late 1800s, we have been told that science and religion don't mix. This idea of a permanent state of conflict between science and religion has so permeated our consciousness that you may have raised an eyebrow when you first stumbled upon this YouTube channel. You might have even chuckled at the very idea of a scientist pursuing a life of sanctity, or a religious ever contributing to science. Why did you find this humorous? It's funny because we instinctively know we're mixing two different domains of human activity, science and religion. An example of mixing scientific practices in the domain of faith, an example that Professor Gould notes in his own book, is the story of Thomas the Apostle, also known as Doubting Thomas. If you're a little rusty on the story of good old Doubting Thomas, it goes roughly like this. After his resurrection, Jesus appeared to the boys in a locked upper room, and there was great rejoicing. Unfortunately, good old Tom wasn't present. Tom returns, and the boys tell him that Jesus is risen from the dead and had just the other day popped in for a visit. Tom doubts the veracity of their story, saying, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week goes by. The boys are still in the locked upper room, and guess what? Jesus visits again. And this time, Tom is there. Jesus turns to old Tom and says, "Okay, conduct your experiment and make your observations. Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas falls to his knees and believes, confessing, "My Lord and my God." Now, St. Thomas's mistake was not in admirably applying the key principles of scientific inquiry, namely observation, experimentation, and data collecting, but doing so within the wrong domain, namely the domain of faith. Jesus points this out when he cautions Thomas, "You have believed because you have seen me. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." As Professor Gould states in his book, the moral and philosophical lesson to be learned is this: in the domain of morals and ethics, blessed are the steadfast. For example, if we have to go back to first principles every time we're tempted to murder, then our grasp of the sixth commandment is a tentative one indeed. Conversely, in the domain of the physical sciences, blessed are those who are appropriately skeptical until the data has been collected, analyzed, and peer-reviewed. Where some people go astray is when they feel that in order to work in one domain, be it science or religion, they must pretend the other doesn't exist. Gould argues for a proper relationship between science and religion under the acronym NOMA, Non-Overlapping Magisteria. He first proposed NOMA in a 1997 essay that appeared in Natural History magazine. Magisteria is the plural form of the Latin word magisterium, which comes from the Latin word magister, or teacher. Magisterium refers to a domain of authority and teaching. Hence, Catholics speak of the magisterium or teaching authority of the Church in matters of faith and morals. Under NOMA, Professor Gould speaks of magisterium as a domain where one form of teaching holds the appropriate tools for meaningful discourse and resolution. Accordingly, the magisterium of science covers the empirical realm that includes such things as facts, how the universe and its component parts, energy, space, and time, are structured, as well as theories, the causal relations that explain why the temporal world works the way it is observed to work. Similarly, the magisterium of religion extends over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. Under Gould's vision of NOMA, it's strictly inadmissible for one magisterium to exercise its tools or methodologies in the rightful domain of the other. Gould sets forth two primary claims in designating his conception of the proper relationship between science and religion under NOMA. First, that these two domains, science and religion, hold equal worth and necessary status for any complete human life. Second, that they remain logically distinct and fully separate in styles of inquiry. However much and however tightly, we must integrate the insights of both magisteria to build a rich and full view of life, traditionally called wisdom. Well aware that in the real world, keeping the two magisteria distinct and separate is not easy, Professor Gould notes in his essay on NOMA, quote, "Each subject has a legitimate magisterium or domain of teaching authority, and these magisteria do not overlap. This resolution might remain all neat and clean if the non-overlapping magisteria of science and religion were separated by an extensive no-man's land. But in fact, the two magisteria bump right up against each other, interdigitating in wondrously complex ways all along their joint border. Many of our deepest questions call upon aspects of both for different parts of a full answer, and the sorting of legitimate domains can become quite complex and difficult." End of quote. I have always imagined the science-religion joint border Gould is describing to be like the fractal boundary between land and sea. The closer you look, the more complex the boundary becomes. As reasonable as NOMA sounds to me, not everyone is thrilled with the idea. The first principle of NOMA, that the domains of science and religion both hold equal worth and are both necessary for any complete human life, is heavily contested. There are devotees of one domain who deny the other domain's right to exist. Partisans on both sides are skeptical that the other side will indeed respect the independence of each magisterium and are fearful the other side will encroach on their turf. The second principle, that each magisteria remain logically distinct and fully separate from the other, is also problematic. There are those who do not accept that science should have exclusive custody of facts and theories, while there are others who are unsure of religion alone laying claim to ultimate meaning and morals. On both sides, we find those who think that to accept the existence of one magisterium necessarily nullifies the other. Then there are those who deny any such thing as objective truth and/or deny there is any ultimate meaning to existence, who are also unlikely to be fans of NOMA. Acknowledging these objections, while presuming goodwill on all sides, I carry on in the belief that NOMA is a useful guide for conducting our affairs. Is NOMA perfect? I doubt it. Can a better scheme than NOMA for mediating between these two domains of human activity be envisioned? Most likely. Nevertheless, I would suggest we not let the best be the mortal enemy of the good. Though a scientist, I am really an engineer at heart. I have often found that good is good enough. So long as we keep in mind the limitations and imperfections of any tool, algorithm, or scheme, then we can still make progress towards our goal, even if that tool be imperfect. I should also like to take this moment to point out that Professor Gould was not himself a believer, but, rather, a self-described agnostic who, nonetheless, saw the value of both science and religion in the pursuit of living a full and rich human life. A sentiment echoed in a quote attributed to Brother Alwyn Macumber when he observed, "Faith and reason are the shoes on your feet. You can travel further with both than you can with just one. I join Professor Gould in encouraging all people of goodwill to embrace both science and religion in their pursuit of living a full human life. I encourage those who do not believe religion to have a place in their life to at least be knowledgeable of what religion truly says on issues of morals and ethics, and in particular, why Christians believe humans possess free will, that existence does have meaning. I would humbly invite you to consider this proposition, that simply possessing a vast amount of knowledge is not the same as being wise. Similarly, I encourage people of faith, and in particular Christians, to engage with what science can teach us about creation. I'll even be so bold as to maintain that, analogous to St. Jerome's stark dictum that ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ, ignorance of creation is ignorance of the Creator. Am I asserting that to be the very model of a modern faithful Christian, you have to be an expert in all things vegetable, animal, and mineral? That you must be very good and integral in differential calculus and know the scientific names of beings animalculous? Of course not. No more than St. Jerome meant that everyone had to be fluent in Koine Greek or classical Hebrew. I'm not insisting that we all become natural philosophers. What I do hold is this: if as Christians we need to know God's word in Scripture to know His Son, then so too we should try to understand as best we can all things visible, as well as all things invisible, to better know our Creator. Rocks of Ages was published in March of 1999. Sadly, after already surviving a bout with cancer in 1982, Stephen Jay Gould was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in early 2002. Doctors determined it to be adenocarcinoma of the lung, an aggressive form of cancer which had already spread to his brain, liver, and spleen. Stephen Jay Gould died 10 weeks after the diagnosis on May 20th, 2002. In his all too short 61 years of life, Stephen Jay Gould made major contributions to science. For my money, his greatest intellectual legacy will be NOMA, and in reminding us that by striving to cultivate both the domains of science and religion in our lives, we stand to gain something truly more precious than rubies, something exalted by one of the most beautiful words in any language: wisdom. If you're interested in reading Professor Gould's book, Rocks of Ages, I've included a link to the book in this video's description. I also talk about NOMA in my own book, Holy Scientist, published by the Catholic Truth Society. Links to my book can be found as both a pinned comment and as a link in this video's description. To keep both YouTube and the FTC happy, I need to make a disclaimer that as an Amazon affiliate, I make a little money whenever you make a purchase using one of my sponsored links. There's no extra cost to you, but it does help me to defray some of the expenses of making these video indiscretions. So thank you for any support you can throw my way. You can learn more about the science versus religion conflict myth by watching this video, cleverly entitled The Science versus Religion Conflict Myth. But do so only after first hitting this video's like and subscribe buttons. Till we meet again, in all the good that you strive to do, Godspeed.